Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Five podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Locals. Also, because YouTube doesn't always give you a notification of a new video, even if you subscribe and hit the notification bell. If you follow me there, you will be able to see notifications for videos that are coming in the future. Also, don't remember that you can support me so directly at Locals and engage with the channel and make recommendations for future content and recommend guest appearances and so on and so on. So I see we've already got Cool Chickens, Minoan, and Zero World. Hello, guys. While we wait for some more people to come in, I'll give you a brief introduction. So I remember, I think when I was in college, I read C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves. And I remember this chapter on Philia, friendship, was very influential for me. So I decided to reread it a little earlier this year. And I felt his discussion on the love of Storge was good and the love of Philia was good. But then Eros and Agape, I thought he did a really awful job. If you want more of my thoughts on why Lewis didn't do a good job, check out Lambda's Bible Studies video that I did with him on the Four Loves, or you can get into some of my criticisms of Lewis there. But this is as a preface because it was with this that I decided, well, hey, maybe let's think about the Four Loves again and how I would have done things differently, where I think Lewis didn't do what I think he ought to have done, and can we do a better job? So the first thing is, let's sort of unpack a little bit what these four loves are. So this is a Christian conception of love. So there's Storge, which is there's like as I describe the levels that you can get. This is just a very surface overview, which means love of family. So Storge is actually literally in the Greek love of the family. And then we have Philia, which is love of the friend. And we have Eros, which is typically associated with lovers. And then we have Agape, which is God's love for man. So we can view these loves in broadly two broad categories, that which is unlovable and that which is lovable. So for Storge and Agape, which I would agree with Lewis, both are more alike than to the other two, is you love something that isn't yet lovable, right? So you might love your children, even though when they're infants, there's nothing yet good or pleasant about them. And of course, God loves the sinner. So you see the potential for something lovable. So you put in the effort in order to allow that object of one's love to become lovable. And then you have the other two, which are loving what is already lovable. So friendship, Aristotle says, the highest form is the love of the good friend. You love what is good in your friend's soul. And then in Eros, you love the beauty of the beloved's body, right? So then you have, what are the differences? Well, Storge and Agape are different in that Storge is you love someone that's unlovable, that has not wronged you or hurt you, whereas Agape, it's someone that hurt you. And then in Philia, you love an already desirable soul. And then in Eros, you love an already desirable body. And so those are the sort of broad framework you can look at this. And I thought, well, what if we add this other overlay? Things tend to come in threes, right? Plato in the Phaedrus has the idea of the charioteer and the horse. So you've got the black horse, which represents the appetitive side, food, drink, carnal desire, bodily appetites, and excess. The white horse represents spirit, or thumos, courage, bravery, which comes from the heart. And then the charioteer, which represents reason and logic, and it's the goal of the charioteer to guide and direct the others. So we also have Helde Hux. Hello, everybody. So then I thought, well, what if we were to overlay these three divisions that Plato has as an expression of the soul onto each of these loves? And the reason why I thought that was Aristotle's already intuitively divided friendship into three categories, which we'll get to a little bit more when we get to friendship. And I thought, well, can we do it for the others? Can we do it for Storge? Can we do it for Eros? And can we do it for Agape? And I thought, well, let's try and see. And my appearance on Lambda was sort of the first attempt. And I've been doing some thinking more, and I think there's more to say. So firstly, we can say that the black horse represents a kind of tactile relationship. The white horse represents motion. So it's, you're when courage in this context is going to be martial courage. It's classical Greek, right? So it's about moving, doing things. And then the charioteer represents thought. So let's look at Storge. One of the things that Lewis wants to include in Storge, beyond just love of children and parents, is also love of animals and location. And I think, well, so working with that, at first I thought, etymologically, it's a little broader. It's narrower, the word. It just means love of children, love of parents. But can we have a more broader extension of this, especially if we have this overlapping principle? So the way I divide Storge up is you have the love of the kith and kin, which is the dictionary definition. And then we have the love of locations, which is the extension as a application of the white horse, and then the love of the cosmos itself, or the world, which is the extension of the charioteer. So Storge is a love that is based in rootedness. Firstly, as an infant, you can't walk or move, so your first experience of this love is with your parents. And then as one grows up, one is able to walk around and move and then experience one's own location. So that's why people have this instinctive love and tie to the land. And then if you're able to then move to other parts of the world, you can then see the beauty in these other parts of the world and then have what we might call this more cosmic level, the charioteer level of the love of all of these things. Now, it's also a progression that as you pass through one, you go into the other, right? Because what limits you to the love of parents? Well, you can't move. You're an infant. You can't get around. As you develop under that relationship, then you get to be able to move around. So then your circle of love in the Storge sense can include things like your location, which includes things like the flora and the fauna there. So you might grow up in the forest, in the woods. Not only do you love where you live, you love the trees, the fauna, and you love the deer, the animals. And then if you can travel to other places, like say, the desert or the hills or the grasslands, you can then have similar experiences. And that is a representation. So the first one is a representation, again, of the black horse. It's very bodily oriented. The second one is an expression of coming from the heart to move, to travel. And then the third one is an operation of the intellect in order to see that there. Now, the other thing that you see when you realize the cosmic level of love, you then also can realize how other people who have different kith and kin and different locations can love them the same way you love yours. And furthermore, that can be the germ by which you get them to the highest love, the love of the cosmos. And so even if they are not able to undergo through the same intellectual process you did to get to the love of the cosmos, you have seen the path to get there, so that you can then, through imitation, by leading them to imitate you rather than ratitionation, get them to that point. So there's this complex web here for the Storge. Now we go to Philia, which is love of the useful in someone, the love of the pleasant in someone. So something about their character, maybe they make you laugh, maybe you just like being around them, and then love of the good. And so, a useful friend is someone who's maybe at the level of a business colleague. The problem with such relationships is they last only as long as the use. Maybe you like someone because they're, a little bit higher up the ladder. So the first one, useful, represent the black horse. It's appetitive. You're acquiring something, usually money, in order to then spend it on something else. So it's this desire to acquire, acquisitiveness. It's this appetitive desire. Whereas the love of the pleasant is coming from the heart, thumos, and it's this idea that there's something about their character, like, for example, what was commonly thrown around in the aughts was the term winsome. Maybe that person was winsome and you loved him for that. But if that goes away, then you no longer love that person. And then there's the love of the good, which Aristotle says is this conception of the soul that is a soul that is aligned through habit to the good. And it creates this soul that is itself good and oriented towards the good, such that if you love that, and that's what you love in your friend, then that is the kind of thing such that can last over time. There's a great scene in Oliver Stone's Alexander the Great, where young Alexander is talking with Aristotle about friendship and these loves. And then Aristotle says to Alexander that it's the kind of love of the good in the soul of another man that is the kind of love that can build a city-state, which I think is an excellent way in cinema of portraying this complex Greek thought that we see here. And by the same rule that I mentioned above with Storge, so for example, Aristotle thinks that certain people, because they lack rational capabilities, cannot achieve the love of the good and can only be either use loves or pleasant loves. But I don't think that's necessarily the case, because even if someone has the rational, so the path that one has to travel to get to the highest experience of that love is not necessarily purely a mental act. It's an act that you still have to go through. So someone who has the mental capacity, say, we'll call him the guide, can then guide other people through to that location. So somebody could be a lover of the good friend, the perfect friend, and find a useful friend, and maybe even realize that that useful friend cannot ever understand what he understands. But through the process of imitation, the friend who loves what is useful can become the friend that loves what is good. And so we see that there is, I think, hope for one who is not as intellectually rigorous and able to do so. We have with Eros, the first black horse expression of it is the love of the opposite sex. The spiritual, the thumic expression of it is the love of adventure. And then the rational element is the love of new ideas. Eros is fundamentally a drive to give birth to something, a child, an experience, an idea. So, two lovers give birth to a child, someone who goes on an expedition to explore, gains new experiences, new knowledge. And then you can then be, to quote Plato, the midwife of an idea, which is sort of like an initiation into a higher level. And it's this initiation of the higher level that is the midwifing of ideas. And so Plato in both the Theaetetus and the Symposium makes references to concepts like pregnancy and midwifing, but this time to an idea. And so we see that much in the same fashion, let's say that a man has reached the level of giving birth to an idea. He could still, in theory, love a woman who's lower down. Either she's at the black horse level or the white horse level, and can never really comprehend the charioteer level, but through, again, imitation, can come to some appreciation of that love, even if she can't directly understand the reasoning inferences to get there. This then leads us to agape. So then what is agape? Well, I'll quote the Bible, because this is a Christian term. Well, it's in the Greek, but then it becomes a Christian term. 1 John 4:19 says, we love him because he first loved us. So God first loved the sinner. So it's a thing that originates in God and begins first from an act of God's will towards us. But then Paul in Romans 5:8-11 says, but God demonstrates his own love toward us, and that love in Greek is agape, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more than having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from the wrath through him. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his son, much more having been reconciled, we shall live by his life. And not only that, but we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received the reconciliation. So I don't think agape is, or at least since this is still a work in progress, I haven't divided agape into 3 sections. I don't think it really can be, because what agape is another set of overlays that creates a second overlay that perfects and clarifies the other 4 loves that have been distinguished into essentially a total of 12 parts due to the application of the tripartite framework of the Platonic soul. So then, how might this perfection take place, right? So let's go back to where we started with Storge. Let's say that somebody loves kith and kin. That can evolve into ancestor worship. If someone can love their location, that can evolve into the worship of groves. If someone loves the cosmos, that can evolve into worship of the universe, into pantheism. What agape would do as an overlay to this would be a corrective where you love those things where they ought to be in location to themselves and to God. Because one of the things that, as Augustine points out, that warps loves is when loves replace God. And so what agape does in this case is all 3 of those, your people, your location, and the universe, can all become objects of idolatry. Agape as an overlay would be loving these things such that you love them in a way that points to the one who created them, God. Philia would be in a similar way. So with the overlays of agape. One is useful in just such those ways that can direct someone to salvation. One is pleasant in just such those ways that can direct someone to salvation. And then one is good in just such those ways that one is directed towards salvation. And so what it does is it reorients the focus. Because while Aristotle speaks of something as the virtue, as this sort of abstract set of principles, what agape does is it takes all of that. And so useful might be directed to making money, pleasant might be directed to just some sort of emotional satisfaction. All three of those are useful, pleasant, and good in this new sense, insofar as they facilitate your reorienting to God. And then now we have Eros, again with the same lens. The black horse, the love of the opposite sex, is perfected in Christian marriage. The love of adventure is perfected in the idea of the Irish green martyrdom. So for the Irish, you had three kinds of martyrdom. You had the white martyrdom of like fasting and self-denial. You had the red martyrdom of dying for Christ. And then you had the green martyrdom of going on expeditions of adventure, of missionary adventures to find new converts. So we have the legends of St. Brendan, for example. And then we have giving birth to someone in the faith as a midwife, a connection that Paul makes directly with regards to Timothy. So we see that what agape does in these cases is that it perfects all four of these main loves and their three components in such that way that it directs them. By loving those particular objects, you are then driven to the love of God. And what's interesting here is that in all of these cases, someone who has both achieved the level of charioteer through discipline and rational capability, as well as achieved agape through the process of sanctification, can also then reach down into these lower levels, understanding them for what they are, not turning them into idols, and appreciating them for what they are, and then helping other people through experience to get there. Because, of course, Christ, in the Christian conception, is God and knows more than any one man could possibly know, and yet was able, through his example, to lead us to the knowledge of salvation. And so in that regard, the Christian what then we would expect to see in a Christian community that is fully embedded in this understanding of the four loves and their overlays of the chariot and agape is that we would want to see a social arrangement. Let's call it a political arrangement, going back to what is a friend from last week. The idea that they would be the ones who were the political managers, so to speak, what the Bible calls, the elders and the presbyters and the deacons. And then they're the ones who have reached that level who can then reach down and bring the others forward through example. So what are some of the things we can understand from this and take from this? As I said before, as you climb the ladder, you do not kick the rungs out beneath you. You accept them. So for example, again, someone could be a good friend and is still useful and pleasant. And when you get to the top and look down, you don't necessarily despise those lower elements, because in some sense, those lower elements are still a part of you, or still potentially a part of you, right? Because what's interesting is that when you get to look at these four loves from the point of view of reason, you can reach the level of the charioteer without actually having to traverse through the lower levels. Some people have to go through the lower levels to get there. So, for example, one could achieve the love of giving birth to an idea without ever having loved the opposite sex. One could come to the love of a good friend without having ever loved a useful friend. Most people don't get there that way, but some can. It's like a shortcut, a complete end run down the lower levels. But when you understand from that vantage point, however you get there, whether by traversing the lower levels or by getting there through some sort of flash of inspiration, you can then look down and understand them for what they are as pointing to this higher level. And all of these four themselves, or three rather, point to agape. So I should rephrase that. There's 9. There's 3 loves, and there's 3 divisions of each one. And then agape is a simple love without division. That's how I'm seeing it now at this point. And so this then leads to another interesting concept, because what ends up happening as you get to the level of the charioteer in reason, and then further perfected by agape, you become more alike than not alike, right? So let's say, somebody grew up in a given kinship group and then loved that kinship group and then loved that location and then traveled for, say, as a missionary expedition to another country. And then he realizes that the people there love their people in an analogous way to the way he loves his, and they love their environment in an analogous way to the way he loved his. Well, he doesn't love them in that way. He can see why someone might, and then how he could use that to then bring them to the higher level of loving the cosmos, loving all of creation. And so in that sense, somebody who from this other community then got to that level would now be at a point where has more in common with the missionary than he does with the people that he came from, because he's looking at this from a larger top-down perspective in a way that they don't have. And so as you converge from the top, you go from something that's more particular, again, without shedding it. You don't kick out the rungs beneath you, but you come to something that is more universal. And that would the same go for Philia, because a good friend could be someone from any tribe and tongue and nation, to use the biblical term phrase, because the good is the good. It's only your orientation towards it that is the criteria here. And so what we end up finding is that the once you get a sufficient number of individuals that get to this level of the higher level of the chariot, and then furthermore, the chariot level of these loves, and further refined by agape, they end up having more in common with each other than with the people they came from. And it's this kind of understanding that gives rise, both in classical Christian and modern thought, the idea of the universal brotherhood of man. And what then happens is you have what's called the cosmopolitan. And by this, I don't mean a wine-sipping, cheese-eating liberal from New York, where that's really just a pseudonym for city dweller. I mean in the sense of the love of the cosmos and all that is in it, which is the original term, a term that was first used by the Stoics and was later embraced and popularized by the Christians. So then the question is, here's another interesting application or principle from this framework. The difference is that this. Well, on the one hand, you could say that Christianity speaks of a brotherhood, in a sense, within Christ, within the church. And then there's this sort of like secular liberal humanist or Marxist sense of brotherhood. What's the difference? Well, the difference is quite large. And the sense is, while both of them purport to want to have this, what we'll call cosmic perspective, and achieve that level of understanding and love, what the modern humanists do is they eviscerate all the lower levels. So for example, most famously, right, what was, as many people in the circle, love of kith and kin and location is actively attacked by the elites. And they replace it with some sort of bland cosmos or bland world. Well, you have to climb the ladder. You have to do so by climbing the rungs. You can't get to the love of the cosmos unless you have some sort of, again, rational insight, usually without going through them. And the thing is, as an intellectual concept, even if you can apprehend it through the intellect without traversing the lower two, though of course you'd have to at least pass through kith and kin because you were born, then the issue is it still stands on it, right? It's a sort of like intellectual precondition, a kind of causal connection. So just because you can apprehend it through the intellect doesn't mean you then negated the lower levels. They still have to exist. If not for you, then for other people, and also for the sake of the culminating in point itself. And so why these fail is because they fail to have this concept of each one is building upon the other. So we have three discrete loves with three components to them, where the highest levels built upon the lower levels, but also these three are then can be conjoined into then one individual. And if you have an individual who has all nine, I guess I should say, and then a group of individuals that have all nine, you then begin to have a community which we call a brotherhood. And the other thing that they lack is agape, because this is all based on materialism, atheism, humanism, libido dominandi, all of these things. And so the the tripping up point is then the love of the enemy, because what ends up happening is if you don't have that, you just have an endless cycle of violence, which burns down your civilization to ashes. And what we've seen with all these conflicts between, the Cold War, the United States and communism, the Soviet Union, they didn't have a way to get around that. We're seeing that now with the conflicts burning between, on the one hand, Russia and China, on the other hand, the United States and NATO. And so it's a project that they can't ever fulfill because they lack two things. They lack, one, an appreciation of the understanding that you have to build upon the earlier levels and can't dispense with them, which they actively try to do. And then two, to fully achieve this in an actual sense, you'd have to have agape, which they don't have. They don't have because they're not regenerated, but they don't have because they deny that it's even a thing. They don't even see it as a thing that you need to have. So at that point, you have that problem. And so what's interesting here is why would somebody who's reached the level of the chariot want to go down to the lower levels to lead someone out? Well, in a pagan sense, we see this with Plato in the cave. This is someone who has, at least in one of these love, I'm assuming Eros, because it's, Plato loves to talk about giving birth to ideas, being a midwife. So in the Plato's cave analogy, we could say this individual he goes through a journey, right? So there's the love of adventure. He travels up to the surface and he sees through an experience. One could argue that experience of seeing the sun is a sort of metaphor for insight, a flash of insight. He then sees all of this and goes back down to then bring someone else up. And and Plato says, if you do that, you might actually get killed, which usually happens. Plato also says you have to do that. So you could say that this is a kind of like pre-agape, that Plato is seeing the need for this, but there's something that's lacking in the sort of pagan conception and pagan individuals, such that, while you might wish to do it, you can only either at best do it imperfectly, or B, just not do it at all. And all of this is, of course, in the Christian conception, replaced with Christ. Christ is the one who came down for us. He's sort of like, I guess you could say, recapitulating going down into the cave and dying so that we could find our way out. And so then also the people that are not able to apprehend through the intellect these ideas, because it sounds like I'm creating an elite esoteric order where only the really smart people can understand it. Well, it's the really smart people that can understand the map that leads you to that in an analogous way to a captain who knows how to navigate a ship and can avoid whirlpools, shipwrecks, and coral reefs. But everybody wants to get to that destination, right? Everybody wants to get to port, and this captain can get them there. In fact, he's the only one that can get them there. But the fact that they don't understand what he knows doesn't prevent them from getting to port. And so, from a humanist, rationalist point of view, or maybe I would just say a pagan point of view, one might want to do this for the sake of having other people to live with in this new destination. It might be lonely being the one enlightened person. You might want to, and of course, Aristotle said man is not an island. Man cannot live alone. Only animals and gods can do that. So then the issue is, okay, maybe you need people to live in. Maybe you need a political order. And so these are the kinds of people throughout history that we call and associate with lawgivers. People like Moses, Numa, Lycurgus, Cyrus, because they know that they can't do it alone. They have to go back in. And those are, I guess you could say, those are the successful ones. They're the ones that didn't get killed, like, the man in Plato's parable, or Jesus. But Jesus was successful in another way. And so then what you have is this drive to go down. And so what agape is, again, is a further overlay. What agape does is that the one who has the insight to lead people along the path, because they see it, even if the other person doesn't see it. One could think of like the Fellowship of the Ring in Lothlorien. They're all blindfolded and they're led by one of the elf guards. Well, they don't need to see where they're going. They just need to trust the guide. The guide will get them there. And of course, all of these things can be, the perfection of these loves can be observed in Christ, in which case we can then look towards him in order for the people that are lacking the intellectual capabilities to get there. So it's a kind of a give and take a call and response between experience and action on the one hand, and then thought and reflection on the other. And so with that, we can then get to that kind of conclusion. And so I guess at this point, to summarize everything that I've said, there are 4 loves, which can be divided into broadly 2 categories: love of the unlovable and love of the lovable. Storge and Agape love, which does not yet have lovable qualities, either A, because they're unformed child, or B, because they're your enemies. And then the other 2, Philia and Eros, love those that are already lovable, either because they are beautiful of appearance or have a beautiful soul. Storge can be divided into 3 categories: love of kith and kin, love of locations, and love of the cosmos. These can be perfected in the sense that all 3 of these loves now can be pointed to Christ through Agape, and in such a way that they do not become idols in themselves. Philia is the love of that is useful, that is pleasant, and that is good. And again, one with the perfection of Agape, one's usefulness, one's pleasantness, and one's goodness is defined in the sense that it directly corresponds to pointing to Christ. And then Eros, which is the love of the opposite sex, the love of adventure, and the love of new ideas, is perfected in Christian marriage, green martyrdom, and midwifing someone into the faith. Agape itself is, I would argue, a simple love, in that it's not divided into component parts, that it is a love that relates, that overlays and perfects the others, and its essential quality is that it loves those who are unlovable because they are your enemies. And I would argue in this regard, Agape stands over Storge, Philia, and Eros in an analogous fashion to the way prudence stands over courage, justice, and temperance, in the sense that amongst the 4 cardinal virtues, prudence is the means by which, I guess you could say, the efficient cause in which these other 3 are used in the appropriate fashion. And of course, using any of those imperfectly then becomes excesses, and using them imperfectly can lead to excess. And so, right, Agape helps avoid the excess, right? That's the analogous reading of it. If one achieves the love of the cosmos, the love of the good, the love of new ideas, further overlaid with the perfection of Agape, one can then become cosmopolitan, in the sense that not that you're a city dweller, but that you are the lover of the universe and all that it contains. And so all of these loves stand in relation to one another, and in perfection point themselves to God. So that's the end of tonight's episode. Let's see. I was hoping for some election returns, but it's probably too early. I'm not paying attention right now. Cool Chicken, Saint Bernard be a good appendix to this stream. Something he wrote, or is this a YouTube channel, or is this the actual saint? Sometimes you can't tell anymore on YouTube. JLM, I wonder if anything besides removing the dead air from photo rolls has happened since 2020. JLM, I agree. Pets make things better. Dogs better than cats, but cats are okay if you're away from home a lot. Cool chickens, Minoan dogs, and French monks. Ricardo Williams for $49. Thank you. Trump, DeSantis, other. I have no idea. I haven't been following the midterms that closely. I probably should be, because at some point I'll probably do a roundtable on them. Let's see. Nicholas Nall, hello. This is an interesting talk. I'm rather convinced love is necessary for the good life, JLM. Yes, and this actually is a sort of preamble to my discussion on One as a Friend, because in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle sets up the definition of proper loves and orientations toward those loves in such a way that you then can form a political entity, a polis. And again, that's why I referenced that clip from Oliver Stone's Alexander the Great. It's such a love as that between friends of the good that can build a polis. Nathan C.J. Hood, hello. Cool chicken. St. Bernard's on loving God is what I was referring to. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, a lot of that might be really interesting. And I guess also as a sort of explanation, one of the things that I've known for a long time, because again I read C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves in college, that there's different ways of discussing what love is, how, and yet we use so carelessly in the modern day American context one word to describe a whole range of relationships that end up being collapsed into one superficial emotional experience. And it's just like those other experiences, those other realities still exist. It's just that people aren't aware that they exist, nor are they aware of their need to approach them. And that I think is one of the problems that I've noticed over the years, and one of the problems that I've been working on finding a sort of way of talking about that can move it in another direction away from that. Because what we end up seeing now with the politics is, we've often heard this term, the politics of hate, right? A lot of these, well, we could also go back to Nietzsche and resentment. Almost all modern political thought is based on resentment. It's based on defining yourself in relationship to somebody you don't like because you can't actually hurt them. And it's like, okay, if that's the case, then that's just resentment. That's not politics. That's just resentment. Politics is you have to have a actual positive project. And what's lacking in that positive project is a conception of love, the conception of the good, because ideally one ought to love the good. And so we then can begin to move. So what's the utility? We can begin to move beyond the political impasse by having a positive definition of politics, a positive definition which entails this is what we want, which is good, and then framing it in such a way that you can say that, like I mentioned already in this stream, that if you get to the highest level of the charioteer, you can look over at the other group and say, well, look, we have different particulars, but we could, if we work together, still get to the same location. The difference being you're getting there is going to be from a different starting point than, say, me getting there, but we can still both get there. Nathan C.J. Hood, how much is feud to blame for the collapse of love terms? Oh, Freud. Yeah, that's part of it. There's this like psychological flattening. Psychology flattens language, flattens love. Even though psyche is soul, so psychology means the study of the soul, it flattens the soul. Halday Hux, is the English language really that shallow? Oh, sorry. Cool chickens. They're aware of them on a primal level. The problem is English being such a shallow language. Yeah, okay. So then Halday says, is the English language really that shallow, though? John Brown, I wouldn't say shallow, more like simple. English isn't shallow. Also, a language is a reflection of the people. Spanish only has one term for love as well. Yeah, you see, okay. Here's the difference, right? The English language, let's say from William Shakespeare until Tolkien, is highly complicated, highly sophisticated. And even though love was still one word, there was a rich arrangement of contexts that it could appear that would define what it meant, right? So even though it's one word, it's context dependent. If you say that in a simple sense, there was a man that loved his food, his dog, and his wife, we all know that love is doing multiple work here. It's shifting through, but we know that it's shifting. But what we've done is we've created this bizarro reverse where we ignore context and it has one flat meaning. Now that's not a part of language itself. That's a part of this sort of radical deconstructionism. Cool chickens. I mean, as in we have more words and they have less depth. I mean, again, English does have a lot of words. No, not necessarily for the word love. Another instance when English can get into a little bit of trouble is the word hell. That comes from the Norse Hela, which is the Viking afterlife, kind of like Greek Hades. But in the Bible, we have three terms for the afterlife. We have Hades, we have Tartarus, and we have Gehenna. And all three are translated the same in the Bible as hell. Some Bibles have footnotes that explain the differences. but it can get confusing. I think where English can be better is that at a sort of like tactile level, at these sort of lower levels, love is doing a lot of work for things that maybe we should have other words for. But when you get to like higher conceptual levels, like philosophy or literary speculation, I think English Shakespeare is a perfect example. There's plenty of words out there that can be used for this. I think also we've just forgotten how to use them. A lot of these words have been forgotten as well. But looks like we had a small showing today, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the stream. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Philia podcast signing off.